That's what breaks you first, not the screaming that comes later, not even the sight of the flames climbing the wooden beams of the chapel. It's the voices of your sisters still holding the morning hymn, even as the doors splinter inward. You're clutching a psalter in the scriptorium when the first shadow falls across the threshold. The ink on the page you've been illuminating for 3 weeks is still wet. You will never finish it. In 6 minutes, the man standing in that doorway will decide whether you live as a slave or die as a martyr. You are 17 years old, and you have never been touched by a man. That is about to change in ways the church will spend 1,000 years trying to erase from every chronicle, every letter, every whispered confession. Before we go any further, I'm genuinely curious. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching this from. It still amazes me that a story this dark from an island most people have never heard of somehow finds its way to you right now across centuries and oceans. The island is Lindisfarne. The date is June 8th, 793. If you've never heard that name before, you're not alone. Most of history forgot it on purpose. But on that morning, it was one of the most sacred places in all of Christendom. A thin strip of land off the Northumbrian coast, connected to England only at low tide, home to a monastery that had stood for over a century. Monks had copied the Gospels there by candlelight. Pilgrims traveled for months just to kneel before the relics of St. Cuthbert, whose incorrupt body was said to work miracles. The monastery held 47 monks, 23 nuns, in a separate cloister, and treasures accumulated over generations, gold chalices, jeweled gospel covers, silver reliquaries containing the bones of saints. It should have been untouchable. It was holy ground, protected not by walls or soldiers, but by the conviction that God himself would shield it. That conviction died in less than 4 hours. The fog that morning was thick, the kind that clings to your skin and muffles sound. The watchman in the tower saw nothing until the dragon-prowed ships were already cutting through the shallows, 30 of them, maybe more, their oars moving in perfect silence. By the time the alarm bell rang, the Northmen were on the beach. They didn't shout. They didn't hesitate. They simply moved inland with the efficiency of men who had done this before, who knew exactly what they wanted and exactly where it would be kept. The first monks to reach the shore died with their hands still raised in greeting. They had thought these were traitors. They were wrong. Axes split skulls before prayers could leave lips. The Vikings, though no one called them that yet, not in 793, moved in coordinated groups. Some made straight for the church. Others headed to the treasury. A third group swept through the dormitories and cloisters with a methodical focus of hunters who know their prey can't escape. Father Edwin, the abbot, was 72 years old. He had spent 50 years on Lindisfarne. When the Northmen kicked open the chapel doors, he was kneeling before the altar, hands folded, eyes closed. They took his head while he was still praying. His blood splashed across the same stones where he had celebrated Mass every morning since before most of his killers were born. The monks who tried to fight were cut down immediately. The ones who tried to hide were dragged into the open and killed in the courtyard, their bodies left where they fell. The ones who ran toward the beach, thinking they could somehow swim to safety, were caught in the shallows and drowned, held under the surf until the thrashing stopped. By midday every monk was dead, all 47. But the 23 nuns were still breathing, and that's when their nightmare truly began. The Vikings didn't take women at random. They had a system, refined over years of raiding the coastlines of Ireland, Scotland, and now England. To understand why they targeted nuns specifically, you have to understand what nuns represented, not just to Christians, but to the pagan warriors who despised them. A nun was a woman who had renounced the world, who had taken vows of perpetual chastity, who had symbolically married Christ. Her virginity was not just personal, it was sacramental, a living offering to God. To the Northmen who worshipped Odin and Thor and Freya, taking a nun was the ultimate act of desecration. It wasn't about desire, it was about power. It was about proving that the Christian God was weak, that he could not protect even his most devoted. There was also a term for it in Old Norse, Frilla-Christen, a Christian concubine, ideally a nun, ideally a virgin. The Vikings prized them not just as slaves, but as trophies, symbols of dominance over a rival faith, and they were valuable. Nuns were educated, literate in Latin, trained in herbalism and weaving and manuscript illumination. In a world where most women couldn't read, a captured nun was worth 10 ordinary slaves. So on that blood-soaked beach, as smoke rose from the burning monastery, the selection began. The nuns were stripped. Not out of lust, but utility, the Northmen needed to assess them like livestock. They checked teeth for disease, examined skin for sores, judged age and childbearing potential. Abbess Hilda, who was 59 and had led the women's cloister for 20 years, was deemed too old. They slit her throat on the sand while the younger nuns watched, their hands bound with rope, their mouths filled with prayers no one answered. 22 women remained. The youngest was 15. Her name, if the fragmentary records can be trusted, was Edith. She would survive longer than most. She would bear 7 children in captivity. Only 2 would live. She would die at 34, worn hollow by pregnancies and labor, and be buried with a small wooden cross she had carved in secret. But that was 20 years away. On the beach, she was still a girl, still clutching the torn remains of her habit, still believing, desperately, impossibly, that someone would come to save them. No one came. The voyage north took 3 weeks. The nuns were shackled in the cargo holds of the longships, dark spaces that reeked of rotten fish and seawater, where the only light came through cracks in the planking, and the only sound was the slap of waves against timber, and the sobs of the women beside them. They were fed spoiled bread and salted fish, so dry it tore their throats. They were given no privacy to relieve themselves, no water to wash. It was deliberate. The Northmen were breaking them methodically, stripping away not just their dignity, but their identity, erasing the women they had been so thoroughly that by the time they reached Norway, there would be nothing left to resist with. But the psychological destruction went deeper than filth and hunger. The warriors visited them often during the journey, not to rape them, not yet, but to humiliate them in other ways. They forced the nuns to speak blasphemies against Christ, to repeat crude mockeries of the Lord's Prayer. They cut their hair, which the women had kept long beneath their veils as a sign of consecration, and threw it into the sea. They made them drink strong beer until they vomited, shattering their vows of sobriety. They forced them to witness pagan sacrifices, where animals were slaughtered and their blood smeared across wooden idols carved in the shapes of gods the nuns had been taught were demons. Every act was designed to prove a single point: your God has abandoned you. Your vows mean nothing. Your virginity, which you guarded as the most precious gift you could offer to Christ, is about to be taken by men who spit on his name, and there is nothing you can do to stop it. Modern psychology has a term for what happens to the human mind under these conditions: learned helplessness. When a person realizes that no action they take will change their situation, they stop trying. Not out of weakness, but because their brain is trying to protect them from madness. First you resist. Then you realize resistance is futile. Then you stop resisting. Then you stop feeling. The nuns in those ship holds were being methodically shattered, piece by piece, so that by the time they arrived in Scandinavia, most had already surrendered internally. That was the intent. When the ships finally reached the Norwegian coast, likely somewhere near Hordaland, though the records are vague, the nuns were unloaded and brought to what the Norse called Rilahas, slave houses. There they were washed for the first time in weeks, not out of kindness, but because Vikings valued basic cleanliness in their property. They were examined again, this time by older Norse women, skilled at judging fertility, strength, likelihood of survival. Based on these assessments, the nuns were divided. 8 of the youngest and healthiest were marked for blow-bow blood marriage. It was a ritual described in fragments across the Icelandic sagas, though most accounts omit the worst details, either out of decency or because the Christian scribes who later recorded the sagas couldn't bring themselves to write it plainly. But enough survives in pagan sources, in runic inscriptions and archaeological grave goods, to reconstruct what happened. The ritual took place during a blot, a sacred festival, held 3 times a year to honor the gods. The captive was led to a stone altar in a forest clearing, naked, hands bound. The Jarl claiming her stood opposite, dressed in ceremonial armor. Between them, a gogi, a pagan priest, conducted the rite. First, a horse was sacrificed. Horses were sacred to Odin, and their blood was believed to carry divine power. A gogi collected the blood in a bronze bowl, mixed it with fermented mead, and forced the captive to drink it while chanting invocations to Freya, goddess of fertility, and Frigg, goddess of marriage. Then the Jarl cut his own palm with a ritual blade and made the captive do the same. They pressed their bleeding hands together, and the gogi bound them with a leather cord, creating a blood bond that, in Norse belief, tied their spirits together forever in this life and the next. The final stage of the ritual was public. The Jarl claimed the woman on the altar while the community watched. It was not an act of passion. It was a religious rite, performed to the rhythm of drums and chanted hymns, meant to bind the woman to her new master and prove the dominance of the Norse gods over the Christian one. For the nuns, this was annihilation. They had spent years, some of them decades, cultivating spiritual purity. They had memorized psalms, fasted, scourged their own bodies to suppress desire. Their entire identity was built on virginity as sacrament. Now that virginity was being ripped away in a pagan ritual explicitly designed to defile what they held most sacred. Many cried out in Latin, calling on the Virgin Mary, on Christ, on God the Father. The Northmen took their cries as proof the ritual was working, that they were breaking the Christian God's hold over these women. After the blood marriage, the life of a Frilla Christian followed a brutal routine. She lived in her master's household, usually in a small room, separate from his legitimate wife, but within the same compound. She had no rights. She could not refuse him. She could not leave. She worked from dawn until dark, weaving, cooking, tending livestock, grinding grain. The nuns, because they were literate, were often given additional tasks, keeping trade records, teaching the household's children to read runes, preparing herbal medicines. Pregnancy was inevitable. Vikings prized large families. They believed many children brought prosperity and favor from the gods. A Frilla who became pregnant received no rest, no special care. She labored until the moment of birth, delivered with only other slaves to assist her, and returned to work within days. The children born to these unions occupied a strange legal space. They were not automatically slaves, but neither were they free. The master could acknowledge them as legitimate offspring, reduce them to slavery, or practice utbur, infant exposure, leaving unwanted babies in the forest to die. The nuns, who had lived cloistered lives and never been touched by men, were now enduring repeated pregnancies that broke their bodies. Many died in childbirth. Those who survived often developed obstetric fistulas, internal injuries that caused permanent incontinence and chronic pain. There was no surgery to repair it. These women lived the rest of their lives in agony, leaking urine and feces, shamed by their own bodies, unable to escape. But what destroyed them most completely wasn't the physical suffering. It was the forced spiritual corruption. The Northmen weren't satisfied with owning their bodies. They wanted to convert them, to make them abandon Christ and accept the Norse gods. They forced the nuns to participate in blood sacrifices, to slaughter animals and smear blood on idols. They made them swear oaths to Freya, begging for fertility. They taught them songs in Old Norse that praised Viking conquests and mocked the nailed god. Some resisted for years, praying the Psalter in secret, tracing crosses in the dirt when no one was watching. But the pressure was relentless. Their captors mocked them endlessly, asking where their Christ was now, why he hadn't saved them, why their precious virginity hadn't protected them. After years of captivity, after multiple pregnancies, after watching some of their children die and others grow up pagan, many began to doubt. Some convinced themselves that God had forsaken them, that their vows no longer held, that survival required adaptation. A few tried to take their own lives. It was a mortal sin under Catholic teaching, but hell seemed preferable to the existence they endured. They hanged themselves with rope when given the chance, threw themselves into frozen fjords, swallowed poisonous berries found in the woods. But the Northmen had learned to prevent this. They watched valuable slaves constantly, kept them slightly underfed to weaken them, and punished failed suicide attempts with public whippings that sometimes left the woman unconscious. The historical record of the Lindisfarne nuns is maddeningly sparse. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions the raid, but says almost nothing about the captives. A letter written by Alcuin of York, a scholar at Charlemagne's court, mourns the defilement of consecrated virgins, but offers no details. Only in the Icelandic sagas written down centuries later do indirect references appear. The Laxdæla saga mentions a Christian Frilla named Hildegun, who could read Latin and taught her master's children. The Egil saga tells of an English slave woman who kept her faith in secret and eventually converted her master to Christianity before she died. Were these women the Nuns of Lindisfarne? There's no way to know, but the timing fits. The sagas were passed down orally for generations before being written, preserving distorted memories of real people. It's possible that some of the 22 women taken in 793 lived for decades in captivity, bore Viking children and grandchildren, and were eventually remembered dimly, incompletely, in stories that blurred fact and legend. What we know with certainty is that this pattern repeated hundreds of times over the next 2.5 centuries. Iona in Scotland was raided in 802. 806, and 825, each time nuns were taken. Kildare in Ireland was struck in 835. Its nuns vanished into Scandinavian slave markets. Monasteries in France, Germany, even Spain suffered the same fate. The Vikings developed a deliberate preference for coastal monasteries because they offered three things: wealth, weak defenses, and nuns. And here is the final bitter irony. These women, victims of pagan violence designed to humiliate. Christianity likely did more to Christianize Scandinavia than any missionary ever did. They taught their children about Christ, kept the faith alive in secret for decades, whispered prayers over cradles when no one was listening. When Viking kings finally began converting to Christianity in the 10th and 11th centuries, many were influenced by mothers, grandmothers, and concubines who had preserved the gospel despite everything they had suffered. The Vikings thought that by enslaving nuns, they were proving the weakness of the Christian God. But the seeds of faith, planted by force in the wombs of abused women, grew slowly, silently, until they consumed Norse paganism entirely. By 1200, the old gods were gone, the temples torn down, the priests converted or killed, the sagas rewritten through a Christian lens. Victory, bitter, blood-soaked, bought with the bodies of women who never wanted to be martyrs. In 2015, archaeologists excavating a Viking Age grave in the Orkney Islands found something strange. The skeleton was female, buried with two objects on her chest, a Christian crucifix and a hammer of Thor. Isotope analysis of her teeth showed she had grown up in the British Isles, but spent most of her adult life in Scandinavia. Her bones showed evidence of multiple healed fractures, consistent with repeated domestic violence. Her pelvis indicated she had given birth at least 6 times. The archaeologists believe she was likely a nun or Christian woman taken young, enslaved for decades, and buried with symbols of both faiths, a shattered identity frozen in death. The Nuns of Lindisfarne have no names in history. No graves mark where they lie. No saints' days honor their memory. The Catholic Church, ashamed that it failed to protect them, chose silence. The sagas remember them only in passing, as nameless slaves in the background of greater men's stories. But their bones rest in Scandinavian soil. Their blood flows in millions of people alive today. Their faith, carried in chains across the North Sea, outlasted the gods of their captors. They were not just victims. They endured the unendurable. They kept fragments of themselves alive under impossible conditions. And without knowing it, without choosing it, they changed the world. The past doesn't fade. It waits in the dark, in the places we're afraid to look. And sometimes, if you listen closely, you can still hear them singing. Remembering them truthfully is the last tribute we can still give. This is not softened history or comfortable storytelling. This is a record of suffering. We don't censor the past or reshape it to feel easier. We show what actually happened. Because history never truly dies. It lingers in silence, waiting in the dark for someone to remember it. If you want more stories the world tried to bury, subscribe and leave a comment, so these voices are not forgotten.